Today we're going to be learning Rosh Hashanah Daf Hey. Today's daf is sponsored by Jennifer in honor of Paul Corwin. Thank you for introducing me to the daily daf and for making every step of this life journey a joy. You yourself are a tree of life. Your heart is full of all the warmth of Shabbat, and wherever you go and leave mitzvahs behind. All blessings to you, my dear friend. Okay, we're going to get started with, let's just do a quick review of what we saw. And I put on the sheet a good chart with yesterday's 5 opinions, right? When are we obligated in Baal Ta'acher, pushing off doing something you're supposed to do? We saw, by the way, I've neglected to mention, I want to just mention, there's a good article by Shuli Mishkin in Flashback this week about calendars and all sorts of different calendars and things in history. So if you haven't yet read it, you should read it. As I said, Rabbaniyot Shira and Chamutal talked this week on Daf Mishalahen all about this issue of Baal Ta'acher and how far it applies and some practical halachot relating. So what we saw yesterday is that there's 5 opinions when you're obligated in Baal Ta'acher, and then we also saw this long list of items that Baal Ta'acher is relevant to. Okay, we'll get back to that in a little bit. 5 opinions. We saw 3 regalim. We saw 3 regalim in order, starting from Chag HaMatzot. We saw only Chag HaSukkot, or we saw 1 regal or 2 regalim. Okay, those were the 5 opinions we saw. The 1 regal or 2 regalim were the only 2 that didn't derive their opinion from the words in the pasuk that we were referring to, Chag HaMatzot, Chag HaShavuot, Chag HaSukkot. So we ended yesterday with, what do they do with that verse then? If they don't learn from there to Baal Ta'acher. Remember, the pasukim about the holidays, Chag HaMatzot, Chag HaShavuot, weren't written in the context of Baal Ta'acher. The pasuk of Baal Ta'acher, this pasuk we're going to darshan today for a while, is this pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Kaf Gimel, Ki tidur neder LaHashem Elokecha, lo ta'acher l'shamot, don't delay when you bring a neder. Anyway, that's the verse that talks about Baal Ta'acher. These psukim about the holidays are written about the holidays. It's just that and also in Dvarim, but not anywhere near there. And right, it's in Tet Zayin. And the question was, right, the drasha was that these connect to Baal Ta'acher. So we then said, well, what are those 2 rabbis, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, what did they do with that verse? And then we said, they use it to teach us Tashlumin on Shavuot. Remember, we said it teaches us that just like Chag HaMatzot, you have 7 days to bring the Korban Chagiga, that theoretically you're supposed to bring the first day, but you have all of the holiday. Also, the same thing for Chag HaShavuot, to which the Gemara now asks, but wait, then you need the pasuk to mention Chag HaMatzot and Chag HaShavuot, because you're comparing Shavuot to Pesach. But Lemay Hilchata Katvei Rachmana at the last line in Daled Amud Bet. For what purpose Katav Rachmana leChag HaSukkot? So why is Chag HaSukkot mentioned in that verse? You could have just mentioned Chag HaMatzot and Chag HaShavuot. You didn't need to mention Chag HaSukkot. There's no purpose. So the Gemara says, no, there is a point. It comes to teach you something else. What does it come to teach you? La kushe leChag HaMatzot. Also, we're going to make a connection and learn something from the comparison of Sukkot to Pesach. What is that connection? Ma Chag HaMatzot ta'un lina, av Chag HaSukkot ta'un lina. Just like Pesach, you're supposed to stay overnight. There's a debate, when are you supposed to stay overnight? Some opinions say we mean you're supposed to stay overnight after the first night of Pesach, meaning the first day you're supposed to bring the Korban Chagiga during the day, and then the day you bring the Chagiga, you're supposed to stay overnight in Jerusalem and only go home after that. Some people actually say it means the entire holiday, and that you're only allowed to go home the morning of the 8th day after the beginning of Pesach. Okay, so there's a debate when exactly this is. Some people actually have an in-between opinion, which is for all the Chagim, it's really the day after the end of the holiday. But for Sukkot, specifically, you have to stay the entire holiday, and that they learned from a pasuk that we quoted in Rashi, very end of yesterday's daf, where it said this bracha, we said the bracha is a blessing they gave to the king on Shmini Atzeret, and there it says, Bayom HaShmini shilach et ha'am v'yivrachu et hamelech. On the 8th day, they sent the people home and they blessed the king. So there you see, specifically by Chag HaSukkot, the lina is after the end of the holiday. But other ones, it's really the day after you bring the korban. Okay, and some people say, by the way, that this applies not just to holidays, it applies to every single time you go to the temple and you bring a sacrifice, you have to stay in Jerusalem overnight. What's the reason for this? So the Sfat Emet says that it's this idea that you don't want to make it look like you just kind of happen to show up there, but you stay there, right? Like sometimes you have a guest and you say, what, you're leaving already? You just came, right? Like it's not respectful to show up, do your korban and walk right away, right? Walk home. So, right, get home. So the idea is you want to stay to show how seriously you take this. So in any case, this is all to teach you, however we understand this is to teach you ma Chag HaMatzot U'Lina, av Chag HaSukkot U'Lina. So Chag HaSukkot is mentioned in the verse to teach you the laws of Lina, just like they apply in Pesach. We don't yet know where we know they apply in Pesach. We'll get to that in a second. But assume we know they apply on Pesach, just like they apply on Pesach, they apply on Sukkot. And just like on Pesach, going back to yesterday, the Chag HaShavuot part of that pasuk is to teach you, just like there's Tashlumin, you can bring the Korban all 7 days of Pesach. You can also bring the Korban the 6 days following Shavuot. You have an entire week to bring the Korban Chagiga, even though the holiday is only 1 day. So that's why Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov say that's the purpose of that verse. Nothing to do with Baal Ta'acher, right? Remember, each of them learned it from a different verse. It's one regal according to Rabbi Meir because it says, Ubata Shama ve'vetem, right? When you get there, you have to bring. So that means bring your sacrifices as soon as you get there, meaning the next holiday. We had Lemoadechem, which was Birabim, plural. We learned from there. That's at the end of all the sacrifices in Bamidbar. So that teaches you that there's 2 Moadim to bring your sacrifices. So therefore, this verse, they learn other things from. Now we have to figure out, where does Tanakama Rabbi Shimon, I skipped a line, sorry. Now we have to understand, where do we get Lina from? Hatam minalan, where do you get the Lina on Pesach? Where do we know that from? So this we already learned in Psachim. Dichtib ufanita baboker v'halachta lo alecha. In the morning, it says there, after you bring your sacrifice, right? In the morning, you should go and go home. So what do you see here? Only in the morning, you should go home, not during the day. The day you bring your sacrifice, stay the whole day. Okay, that's the verse where we learn it from. And now we can move on to the next section. This, by the way, is in, this pasuk is talking about Korban Pesach, but it's found in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Tetzayin. Okay, I think it's Tetzayin. The eyes are no longer good to read the little print at the bottom there. Okay, time to get reading glasses. Okay, so now we're going to move on and say, right, we're doing this ping pong. Tanakama v'Rabbi Shimon, Tashlumin la'atzeret menalehu. We just said that Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov learned Tashlumin from Chag HaMatzot, Chag Shavuot, Chag HaSukkot. So now we have to figure out, but wait, where does Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon learn Tashlumin from? Now, before we go on, there's a bit of a problem. Remember, there were 5 opinions. 2 of them learned Tashlumin from Chag HaMatzot, Chag Shavuot, Chag HaSukkot. Really, we should be asking this question on 3 people, not just 2 people. So who we leave aside? We left Rabbi Elazar but Rabbi Shimon aside. Now, why is that? What was his opinion? His opinion is that it's only Chag HaSukkot that's Baal Ta'acher, right? That's the only, it doesn't matter where you are in the year, when you make your promise, Chag HaSukkot comes, that's the one. Where does he get it from? Because Chag HaSukkot is mentioned twice in those verses. Remember, it started off with Chag HaSukkot, and then it said Chag HaSukkot together with Chag HaShavuot and Chag HaMatzot. So why is the question not on him? Because we're asking about Tashlumin. Where did they learn Tashlumin from? The comparison of Chag HaShavuot and Chag HaMatzot. So really, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon only darshaned in that verse Chag HaMatzot. Chag HaSukkot. He left aside Chag HaMatzot and Chag HaShavuot. So theoretically, they're still available to make the drasha on Tashlumin, and therefore the question isn't on him. So now let's go through. So what about Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon, who really need all 3 of them for the laws of Baal Ta'acher, not pushing off? So the question is, where do they get it from? So Nafkale, where do they learn the law of Tashlumin? We're now off our topic. Our topic was Baal Ta'acher, right? But now we're saying, where do they learn Tashlumin from? So now they say, before we go on, I just want to address a question that Amy, you asked in the chat, which is a very good question, which is what you're addressing, and it's a very good question, which is the drasha here is telling you on Chag HaShavuot, there's Tashlumin all 7 days, which is learned from a drasha. But the question is really, why did they institute this? And I'm sure that you're correct in saying that the reason why they did this is because one day you weren't going to get the entire nation to bring the Korban Chagiga in that first day. So it was a practical consideration. There was no other way to do it if you didn't allow them, because you couldn't possibly bring all the sacrifices all in one day. So it's very likely that that's the reason why they did it. Here, we're trying to just derive it from Psukim. But yes, thank you for bringing that up, because that's a very important point. So now the question is, where did they get Tashlumin for Shavuot is 7 days? Naftalemi ditane Rabba Bar Shmuel. They get it from a braita that Rabba Bar Shmuel said, which is what? he brought a braita. Tana Rabba bar Shmuel, he brought the following braita. It says, now this I'm going to say from the beginning, it's a bit of a strange drasha, okay? We'll see some of the issues with it as we learn it. The Torah said, Maneh Yamim v'kadesh chodesh. You're supposed to count up the months in the days in the month. And then when you get to the end of the month, you're supposed to sanctify the new moon. This, by the way, is finally getting us a little bit back. We got very sidetracked from our Rosh Hashanah, right? We're a little bit getting back to the topic of Rosh Hashanah, which is going to be about determining the new moon, even though we're not going to really stick with this for very long. But just to remind you that we're in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, even though we've really gotten sidetracked here and we're dealing with Baal Ta'acher, which really has nothing to do with it. So, again, why did we get here? Because Rosh Hashanah right? The Chab Nisan is Rosh Hashanah Regalim, which according to Rabbi Shimon, is Balta. It links with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon of Balta Acher that we start from Nisan. We start from Pesach. So anyway, right now, what do we say? The Torah says you're supposed to count the days of the month. And then when you get to the end of the month, sanctify the month, which means really here, bring a sacrifice. Okay? Anyone know where it says this in the Torah? Because you have to count, right? We know about counting. Where do we count? Sfirat HaOmer, right? And we count the woman who's in need has to count her 7 days. It doesn't say anywhere you're supposed to count the months, the days of the month. That's why this is a little bit of a strange drasha. But Rashi explains, where does it say Maneh Yamim? Interesting proof. Shenemal ad chodesh yamim. This is in Bamidbar Yud Aleph, when the people start complaining, they don't get meat, right? And then they get the Slav comes to them, right? They get that for 7 up to a month. Okay, it says up to a month. So it doesn't really say that you're supposed to count the days, but they somehow connect here the fact that there's this concept of chodesh yamim, of days of counting, okay? And there's this idea of you count the days, okay? Because it says chodesh. What they're really connecting here is the yamim to the chodesh. That the chodesh is made up of days, okay? So that means the days lead up to the final day. How are we going to compare this to Shavuot? Now you can see where they're going. Minei Yamim b'Kadesh Atzeret. You're supposed to count days, and really what they mean here is weeks. Okay, in other words, what happens? With the month, you count the days, and then at the end, you have 1 day, even though sometimes we have 2 days Rosh Chodesh, but according to the Torah, it's really only 1 day. We do 2 days because of we're not short. We'll get to all that later. But the issue here is that that in those, right, you would count the days, and then 1 day after all those 30 days you counted, or 29 days you counted, the 30th day will be, or 31st day will be the new moon. You will, Rosh Chodesh, you will bring a sacrifice. Shavuot, you count 7 weeks, and then you get to, now you can see where this is going, just like the days led to 1 day, the weeks lead to a week. So that gives you a whole week to bring the sacrifice. That's what they say. Okay, why is it strange, Drasha? Because it doesn't really say in the Torah there's this idea of counting days of the month till you get to Rosh Chodesh, but somehow they're assuming it comes up in the Torah somehow, and therefore, Maneh Yamim b'Kadesh Atzeret, which they really mean Shavuot. So now, Ma Chodesh Leminu Yav, they're saying, just like the Chodesh, it's days, it's 1 day compared to the days you counted. Af Atzeret Leminu Yav, you counted weeks, and therefore you get a week. So now the Gemara says, but no, you could say, if you're going to take that logic, let's do something else with it. Ema Atzeret Chad Yoma. You could say, no, really, it's only 1 day, because you also count days. You count weeks and you count days. So you count days to get to Shavuot. It's 49 days. And therefore, maybe it's those 49 days lead to 1 day, just like 29 or 30 days leads to 1 day. So the Gemara says, Amarava, Atu Atzeret Yome Meninan Shavuot Lo Meninan. What, when it comes to Shavuot, you count only days and not weeks? No, that's not true. You count, right? Ha'amarmar, it was said, Mitzvah Lemimne Yome and Mitzvah Lemimne Shavuot. You're supposed to count days and you're supposed to count weeks. So I don't know where the weeks are what's important. Now you could answer like yesterday. If you're talking about both, tafasta meruba lo tafasta, right? We said always go by the less. But here they're going to bring another answer in case you were to say that. Ve'od chag shavuot ktiv. What does shavuot mean? Shavuot is weeks. It's the holiday of the weeks, meaning it's clear that the weeks have significance, the weeks leading up. And therefore, let's go back to that comparison and say, yes, it's true you count days, but you also count weeks. That's why when we count the Omer, we say today is the 7th day, which is 1 week, right? Every time you say, it's also how many weeks it is. So they say it's really, the focus is on the weeks, even though you also count days, and therefore it's a week that you get, and that's where they learn it from. So that was all to say that people who don't say the Chag HaShavuot, Chag HaMatzot, Chag HaShavuot, Chag HaSukkot come to teach you Tashlumin for Shavuot. Where do they learn it from? They learn it from this concept of Rosh Chodesh. From there, we can learn to the concept of Shavuot, and since Shavuot is weeks leading up, it's a week you get to do your sacrifice. Again, taking Amy's idea, which is, it was also instituted for other reasons, but these are the ways we connect it to the verse. Okay, right? It was really instituted for practical purposes, most likely. So now the Gemara says, we have to go back to what we saw yesterday. We had this list yesterday. Tanu Rabbanan, we had the bright at the bottom of Dalet Amud Aleph. Okay, and we're going to go back to this now. I'll read it again. Hadamim v'ha'arachim v'charamim v'ekteshot. These are all the things that you sanctified to the temple, right? Different wordings you can use. Chataot v'ashamot, those are obligations you have, right? If you did a sin offering or a guilt offering. Olot u'shlamim, right? Which could be voluntary or obligatory, olot and shlamim, burnt and peace offerings. Stakot u'masrot, you commit to give tzedakah, or maaser you have to give. Bechor, maaser u'pesach, right? The firstborn, the maaser of your animals, and korban pesach, and leket shechan peah. Someone asked at the end of class yesterday, which was really a good question, which is, leket shechan peah are not things that should be on this list. And what was the list? The list was all things where Baal Ta'acher is associated with. The Gemara is going to question Pesach right now and say, what are you talking about? There's no Baal Ta'acher by Pesach. Pesach you bring on Yud Daled Nisan. You don't bring it on Yud Daled Nisan. You don't bring it, right? You've messed up. So there's no Baal Ta'acher by a Korban Pesach. Why is that in the list? We'll get to that in a minute. The Gemara doesn't ask about Lechet Shechan Peah. Lechet Shechan Peah, it's a good question, which is, you leave those in the field for the poor people, and the poor people are supposed to come and collect it themselves. So what is this doing on the list? There is no issue of Baal Ta'acher that you have to pay up. There is no issue. First of all, you don't have to do Shechacha. Shechacha is only if you forgot something in the field. And you have to leave over your corner, but you leave it over when you're doing your harvesting. There's no issue of Baal Ta'acher. So some of the commentaries say that what we're talking about here is, and Leket also, by the way, is the same idea as Shechacha, that it would, only if it happens do you leave it, right? That while you're collecting, you forgot to collect something, so you leave it behind. So again, it's a weak answer, but it's saying that theoretically you could collect it and go divide it up and give it to poor people. So if you were to have collected it in order to give out, then you would have an issue of Baal Ta'acher, but normally you wouldn't really, okay? So it's a possible answer. It's a little bit, still doesn't really generally relate to it. So the Gemara now asks about Pesach. Again, I don't know why they don't ask about Lechet Shechan Peah, but they do ask about Pesach. Pesach bar mikra b'regalimhu. You can bring it on the holidays, right? You're going to bring what? So you say, make sure to do it by, before the other holidays pass, meaning when you go next time in Shavuot, bring your korban Pesach. Can't do that. So they say, Pesach zimna kaviyat. It has its own particular time. Yud Daled Nisan. I akrave, akrave. Ilo akrave, itchele. Either you bring it, or you can't bring it. If you can't bring it, what happens? It's rejected, this animal. You can't use this korban Pesach next year. Why not? Because, right, again, you designated this animal and now you want to use it. If you remember, the korban Pesach has to be within its first year. So by next year, it definitely won't be within its first year. It'll be within its second year and you won't be able to bring it. So you basically can't use it. Although, if you remember, we did learn you can, and we're going to get to that. But right now, they're assuming simply it seems like you really can't use this korban. So therefore, there's definitely no issue of Baal Ta'acher. So we're going to have two answers to this question. The first one, Amar Rav Chisda, Pesach kedinaspa, got there by accident, doesn't really belong here. It's a mistake. Now, you might say, a little strange that would get there, but it's actually really not strange at all. And you'll see this as we get through Shas. You'll see that there's this threesome that always appears. It's Pesach, Bechor, and Maaser. There's a lot of similarities between them. One of the big similarities, they're all brought as a korban shlamim, and they're often lumped together. So because of that, it makes sense. If they mention Bechor and they mention Maaser, it seems like, right, by accident, someone just got, when you're used to saying things, often other things come along with it, right? You're always used to saying Bechor, Maaser, Pesach, so Pesach got in there by accident. Again, remember, this is all, they were repeating these orally as they were passing them down. It's very likely it got there by mistake. So that's the first answer. But Rav Sheshet Amal, he brings a second answer, a different answer. My Pesach, shal me Pesach. You might remember this. A korban Pesach, we dealt with this for a long time. A korban Pesach that you bring, remember, if you bring it on the wrong day, and we say it's a shlamim, right? Because a korban Pesach, if you forget, let's say you designate an animal and then you forgot on Pesach that you had that animal designated, or for whatever reason you used a different one, that animal defaults into a korban shlamim because a Pesach is a type of peace offering, a shlamim. And therefore, a Pesach any other day of the year can actually be brought as a korban shlamim. So if you didn't bring it, then it becomes a korban shlamim. So he says, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to a Pesach that turned into a shlamim. There you have an issue of Baal Ta'achir. You already said I'm bringing it as a Pesach, and now it becomes a shlamim. You're going to have to bring it within that year. Okay? That's, within, again, depending on what you hold Baal Ta'achir is, whether it's within the year, right, through a cycle of 3 regalim, et cetera, et cetera. So now the Gemara says, wait, that's not a good answer because ihachi hainu shlamim. Well, then it's the same thing as a korban shlamim, and it already said shlamim. And if it's Pesach, they reverted to a shlamim. It's basically a korban shlamim, and it already said peace offerings in the beginning of that brayta. So to say that Pesach really means shlamim already says it. There's no point. So they say, no, tana shlamim ba'imach mat Pesach, but tana shlamim ba'imach mat atzman. It mentions shlamim that came because you made them a shlamim, and it mentioned shlamim that got there because they were the default option after the Pesach. It wasn't brought as Pesach. Goes into shlamim, and they mentioned both. Now, why do you need both? You might have thought, you might have thought, since this shlamim comes because of a korban Pesach, it was originally a korban Pesach, you might have thought, Pesach damu. Maybe it's just like korban Pesach, and what does that mean? You're going to have to bring it, right, within the first holiday. And you don't get extra time, basically. Just like you don't have extra time with the Pesach, it has a set time. Maybe this would also have to be brought by the end of Pesach. Kamash malan, that no. Teaches you, no, it gets regular rules of Baal Ta'achir. Again, whatever they are, depending on your opinion. Now the Gemara is going to ask Manan Emile. Now we're going to go back to say, again, let's do, going back to the beginning. We have a verse about Baal Ta'achir. Okay, I'll read it now inside. It's Sfarim Kaf Gimel Pasuk Kaf Bet. Ki tidor neder laHashem Elokecha. When you make a promise, a commitment to God to bring something to the temple, lo ta'acher l'shalmo. Don't delay in paying it up. Ki darosh yidrashenu. Pay attention to these words because we're going to darshan all of them. Ki darosh yidrashenu Hashem Elokecha. God is going to demand it from you. Mi'imach, from you. V'haya b'cha chet. And you will sin if you delay. So if you notice, that verse only talks about neder, a promise you make to the temple. It doesn't refer to all these other categories. So where do we get that long, long list that brayta had of all the different things that Baal Ta'achir is relevant for? Where do they get that from? So the Gemara is going to say, bring a brayta to teach you this. And from this, we're going to darshan all of the parts of this verse. Titanu Rabbanan. Ki tidor neder. So ein li ela neder. Simple reading is just a vow. Nidava minayin. How do we know a nidava? Okay, there's difference between neder and nidava. One is hare zo. You say I'm taking this animal, and one is hare alai. I'm going to do this. Okay, so there's difference between how you worded it. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that here. We'll see that many more times in the Gemara. But here the focus is one. Right, only includes one category, not the other. How do you know the other category as well? V'ne'amar kan neder, says in this verse neder. V'ne'amar lahalan, in a different verse, it says im neder o nedava. Okay, this is a verse from Vayikra Perek Zayin. It says if you're going to bring a neder or a nedava. Okay, some people actually have a different version of the Gemara. There's a different pasuk brought. It appears in several places, but anyway, here they brought this one. Malahalan nedavaimo, afkan nedavaimo, just like their neder appears alongside with a nedava. Likewise, here we're going to assume, even though it doesn't say nedava, it includes nedava, and it's also logical because it's just a different type of promise, but they're both basically, I committed to do something voluntarily. So now we want to know, what about all the other categories? So laHashem Elokecha, again, we're darshaning, ki tidor neder laHashem Elokecha. If you make a promise to God, why does it say to God? Could have just said neder. So they say, Elu hadamim ha'arachim ha'charamim ba'akeshot. These are things that go exclusively to God, even though we did say cherem, there's cherem that goes to the Kohanim. But if you assume they're talking about cherem that goes to Hashem, okay, there's two ways you could do a cherem, but all of these are ways that you're dedicating something, the value of a person in two different ways, either their monetary value or you say their value. We talked about the differences yesterday, cherem or hekdesh, any kind of sanctification. This money goes to the Bedek HaBayit, okay? The first category was animals that get sacrificed. This is other objects which you bring their value to the temple, and it goes to upkeep of the temple. So that comes from the words Lashem Lokecha, because those things go straight to God, meaning they're used for the temple. Lo ta'acher l'shalmo. This teaches you something else, not what we're looking for, but it's another drasha from these words. Don't delay in paying it. So now they say, why it? What do you learn from there? Hu v'lo chilufaf. You're responsible for it, for Baal ta'acher, for the korban, but not for a replacement. We don't yet know what that means. The Gemara is going to deal with that. That's going to be the first part of the Gemara once we finish this Braita. Ki darosh yidrashenu. God will demand this. What does God demand generally? And again, it sounded like God will demand that you pay it on time. But what does it mean here, the drasha? Something God demands is something you're obligated in. So that gives you all the obligatory sacrifices. Have Baal ta'acher associated with them. Elu chataot v'ashamot olot u'shlamim. Here we're going to mean olot and shlamim that are obligatory ones. Okay, so that includes chatat and asham and olot u'shlamim. Olot u'shlamim were voluntary, already included in neder and nidava. But here we're going to add ones that are obligatory. Hashem Elokecha. Okay, this is again, Hashem Elokecha appears twice. First, it was when you make a neder to Hashem Elokecha. Then the verse said, don't delay in paying it. We darshan it. Then we said, Ki darosh yidrashenu. That added all the obligatory ones. And then it said Hashem Elokecha. Why does it add Hashem Elokecha here? That's elu tzedakot u'masrot u'bechor. Okay, Rashi seems to not have the word bechor here, which is then strange because there's never drasha for bechor. But why does Rashi not have? Because tzedakot and masrot, how do you get that from Hashem Elokecha? Tzedakah and maser. So Rashi tells us that by both those verses, when it talks about tzedakah in the Torah and it talks about maser, it mentions Hashem Elokecha in the pasuk. Okay, so if you look at Rashi, Dibor matchil elu tzedakot u'masrot, toward the end of it, it says, L'cha tiyeh tzedakah lifnei Hashem Elokecha, right? For you will be tzedakah before God. Okay, so there's a reference to the connection between tzedakah and Hashem Elokecha. And in Maaser, it says, Achalta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, you should eat before God, which basically means go to Jerusalem and eat it there. But it says the words Hashem Elokecha. So Hashem Elokecha in this pasuk is a reference to those two things. Next, Me'imach, from you. What does that teach you? Zeleket shecha u'pe'ah. Why do we get that? So Rashi says, Shehem chalko shel ani, because those belong to the poor person. Dichtiv be, it says by the ani, et ani imach. So there you say, the ani should be with you. From there we learn, the imach in this pasuk is a reference to a poor person. That's a reference to leket shecha pe'ah. So from there we darshaned all of the things other than bechor, which is a little tricky, whether that appears here or not. It's a good question. We basically gotten almost all of them. Now, the last part of that verse, which is also, in other words, what we're going to do from here to the end of the daf, is deal with two issues in the Braita. One is this hu v'lo chilufav, what is chilufav? And the second is to deal with this section, which is the last rasha is vaya b'chachet, v'lo b'korban chachet. It says, and you will have a sin upon you. That means that the sin is on you. It's not on the animal. What does that mean? What's the relevance? The point is, normally, if you disqualify a sacrifice, an animal for a sacrifice, the animal can't be brought. But I'm sorry, I was just looking at the chat. I got distracted. I'll get back to that in a minute. So the animal is not disqualified. So if I say I'm bringing this animal as a neder, okay, and then or in a davat or whatever it might be, I designated the animal for whatever sacrifice, and then I don't actually bring it, right? So within the time frame allotted, I have a sin upon me, but the animal can still be brought as a sacrifice, okay? It's not disqualified in any way. So the problem is with the person, not the animal. Gita pointed out, which is a very good point, which is Pesach doesn't appear here in the Braita. So what do you see here? It's really a good support for Rav Chisda that Pesach was really just a mistake and it really didn't belong there, okay? Obviously, though, you still have to deal with the Bechor issue. Either you say Bechor really is there, but then it's not really clear where Bechor gets to Hashem Elokecha to Bechor, and Rashi doesn't have it. So in Rashi's Gersa, Bechor and Pesach don't really appear, which would then mean maybe it just didn't include everything. So it's not necessarily a proof, but it is interesting to note. Thank you for pointing it out. Okay, so now let's get what this Lo Chilufav is. Amar Mar. Right? Amar Mar means we're going back to the Braita, and now we're going to go into some detail about things that were mentioned there and try to figure them out. Lo ta'acher l'shamo hu v'lo chilufav. Right? L'shamo, to pay it, that means it and not its replacement. Meaning, right? It means there's no issue of Baal ta'acher by a replacement. So what does that mean? Chilufei mai. What kind of replacement are we referring to? Now, we've talked about before, we've learned that what happens if you designate an animal, the animal gets lost and you bring a different one in its place, and then you find the original animal. So what are you supposed to do? You actually sacrifice both if it's an Ola or Shlamim. So the Gemara says, if you want to say there's no Baal Ta'achir by that Korban, it doesn't make any sense. Because if it's Chilufei Ola or Shlamim, this one that you're bringing, because you would designate as an Ola and Shlamim, but in the end you brought someone in, you brought a different animal in instead, but then you find the original one, that has to be brought as an Ola and Shlamim, just like the original one. So it would have Baal Ta'achir associated with it. And we're trying to find something that doesn't have Baal Ta'achir associated with it. So if you say that is Mikrav Karva, do you remember this? The animal, if you bring a Korban Chatat, and then you lose the animal, you designate this animal for a sin offering, you lose the animal, and then you bring another one in its place, and then you find the original animal, we say that animal has to be left to die. Remember, there's animals sometimes that have to be left to graze till they get a mum, a blemish, and then you can redeem them. This is one of, there's 5 chataot metot. One of them is this case. And therefore, this is left to die, which means if it's left to die, then obviously there's no issue of Baal Ta'achir associated with it. You actually don't sacrifice it. So of course, it's not referring to that. So can't be that one. So we tried 2 options, they don't work. Elamai chilufav, chilufei todah. So third option is, maybe we're talking about a korban todah, which is a Thanksgiving offering, which you bring an animal along with 40 loaves of bread or matzah that go with it, right? There's 10 that are bread, there's 30 that are matzah, and you're supposed to bring it. So maybe we're talking about that. Now, what's the relevance of a chilufei todah? Why is it different than the others? So yes, it's supposed to be brought, but the problem is that chilufei todah is supposed to be brought just as a regular korban shlamim and not with the 40 loaves. So what if I have a chilufei todah? What happens is I brought my 2 animals, and then here we can read in Rashi, chilufei todah, kigon shenit arva berishona. Okay, now the kaimalan. So what happened? I designated an animal for a todah. I lost the animal. I was supposed to bring it with 40 loaves, right? I lost the animal. I now bring a new animal in its place. Then what happens? Before I sacrifice either of them, they get mixed up, and I'm not sure which is which. The kaimalan al zevach hatodah chalot, which teaches you hatodah tu'una lechem below chalifata below tmurata tu'unim lechem. If you replaced it with something else, and then you find the original, then you don't bring it with the breads. Now the problem is you only have, what happened was one of them now dies and you're not sure which one died. So one of them is supposed to be brought with the bread and one of them is not supposed to be brought with the bread and you don't know which one. Now you can't just bring bread. If you have both, you could bring it al t'nai. You could say, if this is the one that's supposed to have the bread, then this one. If that's the one, even if they got mixed up and you don't know which is which. But if one of them is dead now, and you don't know which one is alive now, is it the one with the bread or not? You can't bring the bread al safek. You can't sacrifice anything, right? It's brought as a sacrifice. You can't sacrifice anything, like bring it, if you're not sure. Okay, you're not allowed to do that kind of thing. So they're suggesting that maybe that's what it means. Ditani Rabbi Chia, as Rabbi Chia said. Now, if you notice in what we read in Rashi, he mentions that there's 2 cases that don't get bread. One is chalifata, which is what we're discussing, a replacement one. And one is tmura. What's a tmura? A tmura is a different case. That's where I have an animal, I designate it for my todah. And then I said, you know what? I don't really want to use that animal. I'm going to use a different animal. Okay, there's whole Masechet tmura on this. We'll get to this much later in Shas. You said, I want to bring a different animal in its stead. The Torah says you're not allowed to do that. However, what you did was effective, meaning you can't switch the Kedusha. You can't, if I already designate an animal for a sacrifice, it's sanctified. There's nothing to do. I have to sacrifice it. But if I say I'm bringing another animal in its stead, so the beginning part is true, the in its stead is not true. I can't replace it. But the second one has sanctity also. The Torah says, Hu utmurato yeh kodesh. Both of them are sanctified, and you have to actually sacrifice them both. However, sometimes tmura has a bit of a different law than the original. So, for example, in a korban todah, what happens? You bring the tmura as a sacrifice, but it doesn't go along with the breads. So here comes Rabbi Chia, and we're going to basically say this is just like the chilufin, which is Tani Rabbi Chia, todah shenit arva b'tmurata umeta achat mehen. Again, we have a case of a todah. We have a replacement animal that we tried to replace it with. Both are sanctified. The todah is supposed to be brought with the 40 loaves. The other animal is not supposed to be brought with any loaves of bread. And what happened? One of them died, but they were mixed up and I didn't know which was which. So now I'm stuck. So what do I do? Likarve below, I lost the place. And so they say, Chaverta ein la takana, the one that's alive, there's nothing to do with it. Why? Because you can't sacrifice it. Because hecheli, what can you possibly do? Likarva v'likarv lechem bahada. If you take it and you bring lechem with it, dilma tmurahi. Maybe it's the tmura one, and then you can't do it with bread. Likarva below lechem. But what about, okay, so just don't do the bread. But dilma todahi. You can't bring a toda without the bread. So basically, you're stuck. Can't do it. So they're saying, maybe that's what they're saying. There's no Baal Ta'achir in this case. But you might be thinking, well, if you can't sacrifice it, it's just like the Chatat Shemeta, which means, right, Gemara is going to reject and say, if you can't even sacrifice it, then why is it telling you there's no law of Baal Ta'achir? You only need to tell me there's no law of delaying if I'm actually supposed to bring a sacrifice. In this case, I'm not allowed to sacrifice it. So it's just like the Chatat Shemeta. It's a little bit weird that the Gemara even suggests this because it's such a ridiculous suggestion, because obviously there's no Baal Ta'achir because you can't sacrifice it. So it's a little weird that Gemara actually thought it was a suggestion, but in the end, this is obviously rejected. So we basically tried to say, Chilufei Ola and Shlamim, that didn't work because those actually get sacrificed like the original Korban. We said it can't be the Chatat because that doesn't get sacrificed. It can't be the Todah because that doesn't get sacrificed. So let's try again. Amar Rav Sheshet, Lo'olam lemi'ute chilufei ola u'shlamim. Let's go back to the first answer. It really is that. The hacha b'mayaskinam, but it's a unique case within that. What's the case? And it's normally, if you bring an ola and shlamim and you lose it and you bring a different one and it's dead and then the original one is found, you bring it as a sacrifice and it has the same time obligations as the original. However, what if the following happened? Kigon she'avru alav shnei regalim. Okay, let's say it was before Pesach. Pesach passed, Shavuot passed, and you have one more holiday left. What happens? Humam, the animal gets blemished now. The animal gets blemished, it can't be brought as a sacrifice. So what do? Chililo al acher. You sell it, you take the value, and you buy a new animal. So what happened now? Avar alav regel echad. Now, you might have thought, Salkadat Tachamina, Ho'il Mikoch Kama Ka'ate, right? When do we count it from? I'll give you an example. You have a credit in a store that's valid for a year. You go to the store on the last day of the year, right? You really don't have anything you want to buy in that store. You don't know what to do with it. So you go there and you buy some random item. And you buy it on the, let's say, it doesn't matter when you buy it during the year, but let's say you buy it the last day of the year. You go back the next day and you return the item. So I don't want this. And you get a new credit, right? Now, will the store give you a new credit that will be valid for another year? Or do we say, no, your credit is connected to your credit from last year, you can't do such a thing? And it's a good question. So that's exactly what this is all about. This animal replaced the other animal. So does the clock start ticking from the original animal? We switch the animal, but who cares? Baal Ta'achir is on the person. So it should go by you. You have to bring it. It doesn't matter what animal. That's what you would have thought. But strangely enough, and I say strangely enough because really we learned in the last Drasha, and we're going to talk about this more at the end, which is it's by Haya B'Chachet. The Chet is all about you. It's not about the animal. But here, and really, it needs a little more thinking about why there's this distinction, that theoretically it's really you. It's on you. But yet, if you swap the animal and you end up with a different animal in a way that you were supposed to swap it because it got blemished, the clock starts ticking with a new animal. That's what it means, hu v'lo chilufav. It means there is Baal Ta'achir by the chiluf, but if it gets a mum and you change the animal, then the clock starts ticking then. It doesn't have the Baal Ta'achir of the original animal. Okay, so even though we say it's all about the person, there is some element that relates to the animal. Okay, and again, it requires some thinking as to what this distinction is. I don't have a good answer. Why here we do go by the animal. You would think it would go by the person. You said you were going to, right? You were committed to do this. You're supposed to bring it. Why, once we switch the animal, the clock starts ticking from the new animal? It's a good question. So anyway, that's what they say. You would have thought, because it comes from the koch of the first one, right? This ola, you're only bringing it because you replaced it from the one that came from 2 regalim ago. You would have thought, when the new regal comes, you would have thought it's already shosha regalim dame, kamash malan, hu v'lo chilufav, comes teach you this Baal Ta'achir by the animal himself. But if you switch the animal, because it had a mum, then the clock's going to start ticking later. What about, though, how does that braita work, though? L'Rabbi Meir. He says all you get is one regal. So there would be no case of hu v'lo chilufav, that you replaced it and now you're going to get extra time. What do you mean? In any case, you only get one regel. It's all going to be the same. So Rava gives an answer. Now you could come up with a case for Rabbi Meir where it would be relevant. You're standing in the middle of Pesach. The animal gets a mum on Pesach. So really, theoretically, you have till the end of Pesach. But from the old animal, you have this holiday basically only to do it. But since the animal in the middle of this holiday became blemished, you actually get till the next holiday, because it says you get a regel. If you're in the middle of a regel, you get the next regel. So there would be a relevant difference, and that's what we must say. So again, you would have thought, because it comes from the first one, that you would have thought, when Pesach ends, you would have thought, oh, your clock is done. No, kamash malan, that since you switch the animal in the middle of the holiday, you actually get the next regel. Okay, last part for today. The chet is all about you. Your sacrifice is not disqualified. So now the question, that halacha is not learned from this pasuk, it's learned from a different verse. Where is it learned from? From where Acherim learned it. Acherim is a term that's used to describe Rabbi Meir. So Acherim omrim, Yachol yehe bechor shavra shnato kipsule hamukdashim v'yipasel. You need some background here. Rashi tells you that the mitzvah of bechor, it's learned out in Mechorot from the pasuk, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha tochlenu shana b'shana, year by year. That means you have to eat it always within its first year. So again, what happens? I give the bechor to the Kohen, my firstborn animals. I give them to the Kohen. The Kohen has to sacrifice them within the animal's first year. So now they're saying, how do you know? You would have thought that if you miss the time, again, it's like Baal Ta'acher, and also Rashi even says, if a whole year you get, which is like a cycle of 3 regalim. If you missed your opportunity, you might have thought the animal is disqualified and you can't sacrifice it anymore. It would be in the category of mukdashim, animals that were sanctified that became pasul, and maybe it's disqualified. Be pasul. Talmud Lomar. Therefore, we have a verse to teach us. Now, this is the exact same thing. Once you missed your time, right? You can actually sacrifice it. That's exactly what Vayabachachet means. You have a sin, but not the animal. The animal's not disqualified. It's the same thing by Bechor. So why would you need both, right? We're basically going to say you could have learned it from here. So where did they learn it from? It says, right? You go before God. This is your Maaser Sheni. You're supposed to eat it in Jerusalem. And what else do you eat in Jerusalem? Bechorot b'karcha v'tzonecha, right? The Bechor of your animals. The Kohen's supposed to eat those in Jerusalem. So what do you see here? Makish b'chor l'maaser. Bechor is compared to maaser. Ma maaser no nifsal mishana l'chaverta. There's no time frame associated with it. It's not like you have to eat them within their first year. You can eat them the following year. Likewise, the Bechor doesn't get disqualified. That's where we learn it from. So the Gemara basically is asking, right? If so, why didn't we learn it from this pasuk about the Bechor? We could have learned to all these other sacrifices that you passed the time. You don't need it from the Baal Ta'acher pasuk. To which the Gemara says, no, you're comparing two things that really you can't necessarily compare. You want to compare all our sacrifices that we listed there to the Bechor one. It's true. You need this. Why? What's the main difference between Bechor and all other sacrifices? You might have thought, Hanimile Bechor, this is only true for Bechor. Why? Dilav bar hartza'ahi. What does that mean? It's not brought for appeasement purposes. The Bechor is brought because the Torah says you have to give your Bechor to the Kohen, and the Kohen sacrifices it. All other sacrifices, let's take, Chatat and Asham obviously come to appease. Even in Ola and Shlamim, a voluntary offer, right? It says, V'nirtza lechaper, right? These are all, you bring them to appease God. You're bringing them as a gift to God in case you did something wrong, right? For whatever reason, but you're bringing them as appeasement for God. They all have the kapara associated with it, atonement. So you might say, Kodashim de b'nei artza'aninu emalo l'irtzu. But you're not going to bring something to God that got disqualified. So maybe you would think that even though Bechor, once it passed the year, you're supposed to bring it, you can still bring it as a sacrifice. That's because it's just something you have to bring. So you bring it, but it doesn't have appeasement associated. When you all of a sudden have to appease God, you're not going to want to bring something that has something wrong with it at all, right? Which basically you missed your opportunity. No, kamash malan. That's why we need our verse to teach you. No. Even though that's the case, this is all about the person. And that's why, again, I'm going to leave you with this question. If the whole thing is about the person, and it's really the person did something wrong, the animal is totally not to blame in any way, and there's there's no, even obviously the animal's not to blame, but that there's no disqualification at all on the animal. Again, we go back to that question, then why, when you replace the animal, does the clock tick from the new animal and not from the owner himself and when he committed to do this? So it leaves open a little bit of a question here, and I'll leave you to think about if you can come up with a distinction. In any case, we're going to continue this tomorrow because they're going to bring another possibility where we could have learned this halacha, and why are we learning it from this pasuk? So we'll continue with that tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.